Next up, we have Jeremy Sack from LRW. For those of you who haven't met Jeremy yet, he's a great storyteller, but he also has a simultaneous deep knowledge of the science and has the keen business acumen to make the results pragmatic, in their language, for their clients. A little more on his storytelling abilities. Jeremy has a formula for engendering affinity from audiences, and he does it non-consciously, so it's appropriate for this forum. See if you can become consciously aware of the way that Jeremy is going to make you like him. Jeremy.
Thanks. You blew it for me.
Pressure's on.
All my secrets. Well, thank you, everybody. So I'm going to start with a story. In 1999, I bought a used Saturn. Kind of looked like this right here, although this is a little bit nicer. I bought it with 14,000 miles on it. An old lady had owned it before me, and it wasn't cool enough for her, so she returned it. I then spent $12,000 on it. I put in half, and my grandparents put in half. So it's now 2015, and I still have this car. People tell me all the time that it is old. And I tell them it is sturdy. It is resilient. People tell me it's a little ugly. I tell them they're superficial and that I am substance over style and that it has character. While it's pretty reliable, it does break down now and again, and I fix it. I invest money into this, even though rationally and economically it makes almost no sense. And it was probably about a good 10 years, and maybe my wife, that led me to even consider a second car. So the question is, why do I treat this so differently? Why do I treat my Saturn so differently? And why do I think of it as my Saturn? And the answer is that I have incorporated this car, I have incorporated this brand into my own identity. It is actually part of me. So in my talk today, I'm going to talk to you about this deeper connection. And I probably should grab the remote so I could change the slides. So at LRW, we call this connection identity overlap. And we believe, and we have found, that this is more than behavioral loyalty. It's more than liking. It's more than even love. It is, in fact, the consumer incorporating the brand into their own self-identity. And we believe, as it says here, that this is the ideal brand relationship, particularly today, where there's more options than ever before. Information is fast and at your fingertips. And to be honest, in a lot of industries, whether it's deals, rewards, there are more incentives to switch brands than ever before. So we are a big believer in this idea of a deeper psychological connection between the consumer and the brand. So today I'm going to talk to you about how identity overlap forms, why it matters so much, and what we have to do about it as marketers and as researchers. So, see, totally ruined it for me. So the work in this space actually began with the close relationship literature in social psychology. So for instance, the relationship between, let's say, a husband and his wife. So that is my wife. And one of the things that they discovered in the close relationship literature is that measures that we use all the time in market research. How much do you like your spouse? How much do you love your spouse? How appealing is your spouse? How unique is your spouse? How much time would you want to spend with your spouse? These things actually didn't predict what happened in relationships over the long term. So a new concept and a new way of measuring this concept was created, and the concept is around the inclusion of the other into the self. How much one thinks their spouse is part of them. So this work then got extended into sports and into teams. And these are, in fact, forms of brands. So now we start to see the connection beginning to come. And what is it that makes this connection in sports so powerful and so different? I mean, think about sports for a second as brands. When your team wins, you feel great. When your team loses, you're crushed. If someone says something bad about your team, you act like they insulted you. And if they say something good, you feel this kind of elevated sense of esteem. You're not a player on the team. But what is going on? You've incorporated this brand into who you are. So what determines whether or not you incorporate your spouse or significant other into who you are, your sports team, or other brands? So this is going to be really unremarkable sounding, but I would encourage you to think about it against the way you operate in a business and against how you think about it from a market research perspective. So the first thing to understand is that this deeper psychological connection, this overlap between who you are and who your spouse is, or who you are and a brand, doesn't form overnight. It takes time, it takes shared experiences, it takes stories. So I'm going to contrast it with another concept that exists in both of these spaces, and that is the concept of lust. What is lust? Lust is hot. Lust is intense. Lust is typically fleeting. You can have lust here, and then the next night out, you could have lust over there. While you can start a relationship with lust, lust does not equal identity. Lust can end. So identity overlap is something that is enduring, longer, standing, and deeper in many respects, and it begins with experiences and time. Talk to you about 4 other elements that can help make the special sauce of identity. So the first one is similarity on important self-defining characteristics. So I'm going to go back a couple slides. People don't usually do that. Here is my wife and I. We don't look that similar. We don't have similar occupations. But we have a lot of core similarities in common that are self-defining for the both of us. So for instance, we wake up every day and we think about what we're getting to do that day, not what we have to do. That's a big part of our kind of mantra in our life. And this is what we have in common, and it's deep and self-defining. And that similarity is part of the special sauce of identity overlap. A second dimension is interdependence. Common goals, common outcomes, and collaborating towards those outcomes and those goals, working in partnership to achieve something. The third is reciprocity, mutuality, give and take. When you do something, it's going to come back to you in kind, and vice versa, and that's just understood. And then the last one is the idea of core needs being met, at least a core need being met. And I think of these as sort of intrinsic, ancestral, evolutionary base needs, the really deep stuff. Things like success, stability, belonging. With this special soup in sort of varying amounts and time, you can form identity overlap. So one thing to start thinking about, and I'll come back to it, is to what extent are you delivering on this with your consumers? So achieving identity overlap is a huge deal. So I'm going to start with what is found in the relationship literature. So in the relationship literature, identity overlap, the inclusion of another person into who you are, is the best predictor of the duration of a relationship. It actually better predicts divorce rates than any other stated measure. It also predicts satisfaction over the long term in relationships. Again, not lust, not that first date, not that first night, over the long term. It predicts intimacy, sort of emotional closeness. And then in what I think is actually one of the coolest findings is that it actually predicts whether or not you unconsciously bestow upon your significant other all of the non-conscious positive biases you typically only grant yourself. Right? So we walk around with all sorts of biases. We tend to think things we do are really good. We tend to disregard or situationalize mistakes, but when we achieve something, we think it's about us. If you like your spouse, you don't do it. If you love your spouse, you don't necessarily do it. If you share identity with your spouse, you afford them all of those same biases unconsciously. Now, if we transition into business and to brands, we think, and are increasingly using this concept this way, that identity overlap is not just a measure, it's not just a concept, it's in fact a business goal. So what we have found in our work with clients is that identity overlap better predicts all of the things I've put up here than traditional measures in most cases. It better predicts whether you use something more, use a brand more. It better predicts if you spend more, how much you promote the brand, if you remain loyal in the face of sort of this sea of persuasion to change. You will ignore bad press. Sometimes brands have things happen to them. You're more likely to discount that and ignore bad press, and you're more likely to follow the brand into new categories. And why is this? The brand is part of you, and therefore it's benefiting from all of these biases and all of these sort of identity-related dynamics. So I'll do two quick case studies of some recent work that I've been working on with my clients in this space. So I have a client right now, very large CPG company, and we are part of an initiative where they are building essentially an evidence-based model to understand what can predict purchase, but also what can predict things above and beyond purchase, particularly related to social commitment. So for instance, the idea of inviting a brand into your town and city, or donating to a charity that the brand believes in. And in that work, where we measured all sorts of things, what we found is that one measure was the best predictor of these greater social commitment activities and purchase intent than anything else, and it was how much you identity overlapped, or how much overlap you had with the brand. Second case study example, hospitality industry. I don't know if anyone works in the hospitality industry. I'm sure we all stay in hotels. It is a bloodbath of rewards right now. Every hotel, every program is offering you incentives to switch. These many rewards, these many points, just to get your loyalty, to essentially buy your loyalty. And we have found that those with high identity overlap resist that temptation to a much greater degree than do people who just like their brand. And we've also found that it predicts sort of other behaviors in that space. So really quickly, back to my Saturn. So why do I have identity overlap with my Saturn? One is we've spent time together. We've shared experiences. We have stories. Think about whether or not you're creating that with your consumers. Two, we have similarity. The Saturn is sturdy. It is reliable. I value those characteristics in myself. I like to see myself that way, and that is part of the special sauce. It fits a core need. It was the first sign of success, even though it was used, and I split it with my grandparents. It was the first sign of more adult success, and it also provides stability. And last, I would say that there's interdependence, common goals. I was in this car driving to pick up my wife. We've achieved goals together. So, in conclusion, I think that identity overlap is the ideal brand relationship, and what I think we need to do as marketers and researchers is really 4 things. We need to measure it. We need to measure this type of relationship. While the brand funnel may be changing and the decision journey may be changing, at the end of all of that is a brand and a product, and we think this is an important relationship to capture. 2, we have to track it. It doesn't change that fast. I describe this as taking time, being enduring, but you still want to track it. Are the activities you're doing helping or hurting create this type of bond? 3rd, we need to drive it. From the researcher lens, this can look like driver's analysis, Bayesian network modeling, predicting this relationship. From a marketing context, are we identifying and marketing to the things that our consumers find important about themselves? Are we creating interdependence? Are there common goals we're pursuing together? Are we using social media that way? Are we creating feelings of reciprocity? All of these things help to create this. And then last, we need to activate those who highly identify. So we have found that those with high identity overlap are more likely to badge the brand. They'll wear shirts. They'll promote the brand. They'll recruit actively on behalf of the brand. So when you know who you are, you have the opportunity to activate them both in sort of broader media, but also in direct kind of one-to-one contexts. So in conclusion, I just want to thank everybody. And again, we think this is an important idea, and I'm just happy to have the opportunity to tell you all about it. Thanks.
Thanks, Jeremy. I absolutely love that stuff. Nice job. And I have some questions too. Questions from the crowd. Stephen?
Hi, I just wanted to ask you, Lambda, by the way, a question about your car. To be honest, it sounds like you're a pretty dreadful customer for Saturn, right? You bought one second-hand car 15 years ago. If I was Saturn, wouldn't I want someone to fall in lust with me so they actually buy a new car now?
Yeah, it's a great question. It's one of the dangers of using stories from your life to open when there's smart people in the audience. Obviously, to some extent, a lot of this is about the business you're in, right? There are relationships with brands where when you capture the person, you want to keep them where they are. There are other relationships when you want to trade them up to something more, have them buy the next version, the new thing. And in those cases, it does take more kind of sophisticated marketing strategy. So we do have models that we sometimes used about how do you create lust, and then how do you create identity, and sort of where do you want to be in that framework of lust and identity, and whether or not you do need to sort of churn your consumers across those over time. So it's a great question. I think the answer typically is it kind of depends on what the specific business issue is.
That's great. What's the best way to measure identity overlap, Jeremy?
Well, I won't tell all the secrets.
Okay.
But we typically find two concepts to be really important in measuring identity. First, and this is, I think, one of the most subtle ones, is we actually have to activate the consumer's identity. Right? So think about your market research survey, if we're talking about a quantitative measure. People are just taking the survey. The survey is the same for everybody. And very rarely are you asking people to think about stories from their lives, to think about who they are, or to, for instance, use their name. How many of your surveys ever use a respondent's first name? These are all things that can actually activate a person's identity. And then we have a measure that kind of follows that helps us understand how much a person is identifying with the brand. It's not about asking them a direct question, though. It's more visual in nature.
Wonderful. Any other questions for Jeremy? Thanks a lot.
Cool. Thanks, buddy. Good job.